So I'm here at Socialism 2022 and talking this morning with Robin Kelley. Robin, welcome.
Thank you. So great to be with you.
So great to have you here. And Robin, as most of you know, is a legendary historian with a wide reach. And we happen to be talking on the 20th anniversary of his book, Freedom Dreams. So I thought maybe we'd start there, because that's the book that really, I mean, I knew your work before, but Freedom Dreams is the one that really captured me. So say a word about what it's like 20 years later, look back on the book that really defined a lot of your work.
Yeah, I didn't plan to come out with the 20th anniversary edition, but a couple things happened. One, you had the rebellions of 2020, which, when you read Freedom Dreams, you realize it would not have caught you off guard. In fact, the rehearsal for that moment, I would argue, was the protests after the verdict around the Amadou Diallo killing.
Yeah.
When you saw a much smaller scale version of multiracial communities coming out, angered about the killing of an unarmed black man, as you have a transition from the end of the Clinton era, which a lot of us spent a lot of time fighting. the kind of weird nostalgia about the Clinton years being so great. The same regime that brought us, the end of welfare as we know it, that brought us a crime bill, that brought us immigration reform, that made life actually pretty precarious for a lot of people. And that's the context. And then, of course, I start writing this book, just on the eve of, during, and after the invasion of Afghanistan,
right,
and 9/11. So that was the context for it. Fast forward 20 years later, we have just come out of, we're in the middle of a pandemic. We are coming out of, essentially 2 decades of organized against police violence. Again, we're in Chicago right now, where organizing against police violence was at the center.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like ground zero around police torture and the struggles, not just the more recent struggles in terms of the killing of Akia Boyd, Laquan McDonald, and others, but a long history of this kind of violence. And here we are after 8 years of Obama, with the expectation that things would be different. Of course they're not. Then we have 4 years of Trump. So thinking back to the bookends of, again, fighting against police violence redux, plus the alleged end of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq, the alleged end of the war on terror, which we know is not the end, because we continue to see violence in Palestine. We continue to see the same U.S. response to the Saudi regime, which is, we'll scratch our back, we'll scratch yours. And it appears that nothing's changed, but it appears that everything's changed, And as I was sort of rewriting or rethinking this book, again, I start with the spring 2020. I finished the introduction epilogue after the coup, the attempted coup on the Capitol.
Right.
And so in many ways, that's the context for the book. And I'm hoping that the revitalization of it in many ways will remind us of why we do what we do, which isn't simply to fight to win reforms piecemeal, but to really kind of re-envision a different kind of future and to try to put that in practice.
As you spoke about the 20th anniversary of your book, you did something that you do in all your work, which is you made it international as well as national. You went immediately to the international context. Why is that important?
I can't think of any other way to think. Part of it I think has to do with my own training as a historian. I mean, I started out as an Africanist. I wasn't doing U.S. history. And so I see so much of U.S. history through this lens of empire. And in fact, living in empire made me an Africanist. Living in empire, meant that the book that changed my life before I read Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism was Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And that was how I became an Africanist. So that's a personal context, but there's a political one as well. And that is, we think about what were the political struggles we're engaged in. I mean, I know a lot of people, and it seems like we're always involved in international struggles because whether we like it or not, they're like in our face. They come home. I mean, imagine you can't live through the early 1980s as a young person and not be involved with trying to stop the invasion of Grenada, without being involved in the anti-apartheid movement, without recognizing that what we thought was, what a new generation thought was new, that is the idea of sanctuary cities. The sanctuary cities, those are the politics of the 80s, where you have Central American migrants fleeing death squads, and we're trying to organize around their protection in the 1980s. And so it's impossible to escape it. There's no hole big enough to protect you from the rest of the world. Why? Because the United States is disrupting the rest of the world. That's what this country does. And the irony, of course, is that we expect much of the globe to be internationalist because we think of them as international. But you can't live in the United States without thinking internationally if you're concerned about people, because it's like Dr. King said, there's really no nation that's done more damage around the world. The greatest purveyor of violence in the world is the United States.
Well, I agree with you, and I see it that way. But when you say it's impossible to see the world, I agree with you. It's impossible to see the United States without the world context if you're devoted to human freedom. Mm-hmm. But so many on the left, and certainly on the liberal left, actually make that distinction very strongly. And I think you're advising us to think more broadly and to think as internationalists.
Right, exactly. No, you're right about that. And this has been I think a pet peeve of all of us. I so appreciate your show because you've always paid attention to the world, and people you bring on the show do. But it is true that, the irony is that the left, the U.S. left of the last, say, 10, 15 years. No, let me go back. Let me just say this. Let me just be honest. The U.S. left post 9/11. Because 9/11 was a turning point.
Yes.
I lost a lot of friendships around 9/11 when, mostly the kind of white labor leftists who were friends, decided, okay, well, this is an attack on the United States, and became nationalists.
Exactly.
In the worst way. In the worst way. Oh, you remember that?
I remember it. I remember our mutual friend Rashid Khalidi saying to Bernadine and me, when people were falling away from us after 9/11, saying they weren't your friends anyway. Right. You have to understand that you were, in a sandbox that you didn't really belong in anyway. Yes, and it's so funny. I didn't even think we were going to talk about this, but I remember your book came out. Right. That's right.
And there was this whole debate. First of all, a useless debate about whether we should release this book. Would it be incendiary? And I'm like, really? Are we having this conversation? Well, we're having it even more intensely today, aren't we? About what you can read. But you're absolutely right. The book came out on 9/11, Fugitive Days. And the nice thing is the attacks came. Rashid told us, don't worry about who you're losing. Got a phone call after about a week of threats and nonsense from Edward Said saying, you're doing something right. And don't think twice. Exactly. It's good to know who you're with, who you're in solidarity with. Yeah, and it's also good to know how fragile, for some leftists, how fragile internationalism is also how fragile their understanding of state and state violence is in American imperialism. Because if you really do grasp the nature, character, history of American imperialism, there's no possible way you can stand behind it under any circumstances. You know, after 9/11, I remember I wrote a piece for The Nation, and I think I titled it "Murderous Humanitarianism," which was the title of a surrealist statement that was made in 1932, I think it was. And I wrote this little piece. I got a lot of flack for it, saying, you know, if anything, you know, we need to turn, I'm quoting, or at least paraphrasing, we need to turn this imperialist war, that is the U.S. war on Afghanistan and Iraq, into a civil war. Mm-hmm. That was the argument of murderous humanitarianism. We need to turn this into a struggle for power among those people who actually believe in freedom to stop the war. There's nothing good about war. I wasn't interested in that debate in post 9/11 about this is a good war versus a bad war. As if World War II, which yes was against fascism, was solely a good war. The war that led to the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that's the good war. The war that resulted in the deaths of 27 million citizens of the Soviet Union, let alone all the other people who died, and the war that in the end was about the consolidation of empire. You know, so in other words, you fight fascism in one place and you're kind of victorious, that's fine. But then what's the result? You continue the fascism that started it all in Africa, in Asia, in the colonies.
Really? Yeah, it's mind-blowing, and what you're bringing to my mind is we found a work a few years ago by Carolyn Elkins, Imperial Reckoning, mm-hmm. and it's about Kenya, and you know, the kind of what you take away from it is the British Empire had a great public relations campaign because they were absolute fascists in Kenya.
That's right.
And so they got good PR, but they are a nasty, nasty empire, just like every empire.
Yes, that's true. That's true. As Du Bois had this really great line, it might have been in The World in Africa, or it might have been someplace else, where he says, again to paraphrase, he's like, don't cry crocodile tears over Britain when there's no atrocity that the Nazis have enacted that the British haven't on colonized people.
Absolutely.
You know, and if we really believe in human freedom, if we really believe in it, then we've got to fight it fight for it wherever it is. That is everywhere. And when we do that, we're going to confront empire. You know, and this is a hard time to do that right now because, like you're saying, we have this kind of, new knee-jerk kind of patriotism. We've got even something that's supposed to be as progressive as the 1619 Project, as a kind of way to disrupt the kind of settler story of American democracy. And I understand what's behind it, but there's a way in which even the 1619 Project is saying we need a new kind of patriotism that incorporates all of us. We don't need patriotism. We need a new humanity. We need a new situation where patriotism is not used to continually center the United States. This is a crumbling empire we're faced with and we're living in, and yet there's still this kind of propping up. U.S. foreign policy is all about the United States being number one. The mere fact that we allow, and I say we, meaning the vast majority of Americans, would support legislation that would prop up corporations and give them huge subsidies, like computer chips, for example, in order to compete with China, at the expense of healthcare, at the expense of joblessness, poverty, precarity, so that we can compete with China. I mean, that's just old Cold War stuff.
It is. In my little world of schools and public school reform, it always amazes me that we're going to motivate third graders by saying we're in a war with China and we have to beat China. What third grader, what madness is that, and how does it create a consciousness and a culture of patriotism and lesser and greater human beings?
Absolutely. And how is that so different from saying that those migrants are going to take your jobs?
Exactly.
It's
very
the
similar.
Same thing.
So you raise a couple things I'd like to get to. One is, should the left make the quest for freedom central to our work? And how do we do that?
I think so. I think it also depends on how we define freedom. Freedom is one of those words that has always been contested. In the United States, freedom is associated with liberalism. Liberalism is associated with, we're talking about 19th century liberalism, with free trade, with free labor, not labor rights and justice. Free labor meaning that labor that may not necessarily be enchained, as long, especially if it's white labor, not enchained, but nevertheless, free labor as a way to pay the lowest wages possible to extract the most surplus. That's what freedom is. Free enterprise, and that's how people think of freedom. And that's why I got, when Freedom Dreams came out, like conservatives saying, "Well, this looks like a good book."
Yeah, and they read it. Yeah. Well, what you say goes back in our whole history. What was the Civil War fought over? It was fought over freedom.
Yes.
On one side, the freedom to free the enslaved workers. On the other side, the freedom to own people.
Yes.
And they both used the same rhetoric. They both were saying freedom now.
Exactly. And who got the reparations?
Exactly. Have you read Barracoon?
Yes.
It blows my mind, but the piece in it that I absolutely loved was when Cujo Lewis organizes some of his fellow workers to go to the former master and say, "You owe us for all this labor." And the response from the master is, "Wait a minute, you owe me. I used to own you, and now you've been taken from me."
Right.
It was astonishing. And you have a letter from a former enslaved worker in Freedom
Jordan,
Dreams.
yes.
I forget the story. Maybe.
Yeah. No, definitely. So I have a chapter on reparations in Freedom Dreams, which opens up with this letter. It was partly drafted by a group of abolitionists with this formerly enslaved person, who basically writes his master and says, "How you doing? By the way, I'm so glad you didn't." That when you're not a good shot and you didn't kill me as I was running away.
Right.
But then says, okay, we have to settle score. I want to come back down, I'll visit you, but this is what you owe me. And just calculated the amount. And, in a free market society, though John Locke wouldn't agree with this, what Jordan says in his letter makes perfect sense, because he actually had this thing called his labor power, which in a capitalist system is a commodity.
For sale. Yeah.
And it was stolen from him. And yet, as you said, exactly, if you look at the end of slavery within the Western world, in almost every case, it's the master, the owner, that was compensated. So in the case of the United States, all the border states that were loyal to the Union and Washington D.C., those masters got paid.
Exactly.
In the British Empire, what they part of the story is that the British, they abolished slavery in 1833. They had a period of apprenticeship, but during that apprenticeship they had to pay wages. Where did they get the wages from? Well, because they were compensated by the British government, not the enslaved people. So they had to work for those wages, which are paltry as it is. And part of what the vision of freedom, and so to go back to your question, like what kind of freedom are we talking about? The vision of freedom in Reconstruction was not based on simply capitalist principles. It was based on autonomy and self-determination, saying, look, freedom for us means A, the right to vote and to run for office, and that when we're in office, we're going to basically draft new constitutions, state constitutions, that lay out certain rules. Some of those rules about free public education for everybody. Some of those rules are, land reform, redistribution. In fact, some of that vision of freedom is to make sure that the former Confederates who waged this very expensive war, for which no one who knows who's going to pay the debt, should pay that debt by giving up their land to the people who worked it. That is freedom. That's a definition of freedom that is the one that's foundational to this vision of abolition as we know it, because it's one that's not based on the sanctity of private property. And if you think about what abolitionists in the 19th century, the antebellum period, were struggling with, not black abolitionists, but a lot of the mainstream liberal abolitionists were like, well, we can't just abolish slavery because of the Fifth Amendment.
Right.
It's like, you can't violate that. So how are we going to do it? How are we going to come up with it? Oh, I know. If you have a war, we can use confiscation. Like, why do you have to do that?
Right.
John Brown, who was one of the greatest living thinkers and doers, was like, this is a violation of God's will.
Right.
And the real thief are the slaveholders and the United States for sanctioning it.
Right.
So, we need not just reparations, we need to overturn the whole system. Right?
And still true. I mean, you use a couple of phrases, racial capitalism, abolition democracy. Maybe you could define that a little bit, or just speak into it.
Right.
What is racial capitalism to people who are listening?
Yeah. Well, to put it in the simplest terms, racial capitalism is capitalism. That is to say that capitalism emerged in the Western world and expanded throughout the rest of the globe as a system in a civilization that already had racialism.
Right.
That is to say that even before Africans entered the scene, just within Europe itself, there's a hierarchy of value. That if you're Irish, if you're Roma, if you're a Slav, I mean, we know what Slav means. Slav means slave. That you're valued less than others. And that hierarchy allowed for, when capitalism emerges, to extract greater wealth or pay people fewer wages or less wages, to take people's land because they're devalued. Now you take that idea and you expand it to the rest of the globe. All it means is that racial capitalism, the product of colonial capitalism, is a system that operates just like capitalism in the purest sense, but is always structured by race and by gender. And that's basically it. That's why you can explain things like property values in neighborhoods with black and brown people are just simply worth less, even if they pay more for food or pay more for rent. Race allows that to happen. And it's not incidental. It's not an incidental feature of capitalism. It is foundational and endemic. And so you can't create a better capitalism. It will always be racial. And by the way, what we're talking about is not just the United States. We're talking about racial capitalism as a global phenomenon. You could see it operate in India, in Brazil.
So should borders be abolished?
Yes.
Okay, that was a short answer. That's good. You were just on a panel with Harsha Walia, and you were talking about abolishing borders, and I'm hearing echoes of it throughout our conversation, because you're talking about the kind of hierarchical nature of valuing humanity, and you're saying, no, if we want to value humanity, we must abolish borders. Right. We must create the commons, I guess.
Exactly. I mean, what Harsha Walia says in her amazing book, Border and Rule, and Ruthie Gilmore says so in her work as well, and others, is that some of the two main problems that are reduced to one problem for much of the world is mobility, forced mobility, and immobility, the ability to not having the right to move and leave without having to be subjected to administrative violence versus not being able to move at all. And when we think about sort of the long history of the world, it's a very long history. Much of what we end up talking about is only the last 200 or 300 years.
Yeah.
But what we know of as borders, in every single case, without exception, they are imperial borders. All borders are imperial borders. Even the ones between nations that might have, like that's around China, for example. There's a way in which even China as an empire creates its own imperial borders. And some of those borders are based on the capacity of the state to subject peoples to violence, to taxation, to exploitation. And so the fact that imperial borders in world history are really short-lived, the state as we know it, the nation state short-lived, and it hasn't really done much, to benefit humanity. There's no reason for that. But here's the problem, is that with borders come border thinking. There's an ideology of borders, this is natural divides. And trying to eliminate border thinking is a real challenge. Because, like we were saying before, if you have already decided, or if you live in a culture in which the world is structured into hierarchies, not just difference.
Right.
We talk about difference. Difference is meaningless unless it's hierarchy, because difference is great, but difference here in this case could be lethal. But once you do that, then the borders function as a way to strengthen the kind of nationalist or racial ideology of the Herrenvolk, right? As a way to create enemies, to exclude. And as a way to control labor, which is fundamentally what it's about. The one thing, though, and we didn't talk about this in the panel, but we could talk about this right now, is that borders, that the neoliberal order doesn't see borders when it comes to capital. In fact, the whole organization of neoliberalism is to say what we want are borders for people, but no borders at all for capital.
Exactly.
None.
Labor has the borders,
Exactly.
and capital has the free flow.
And not only that, but that neoliberal order is saying that no state should have sovereignty over capital.
Exactly.
None. Could you imagine what it means to say that you can't impose minimum wages, you can't impose, that you shouldn't have the right to impose environmental rules and regulations, that you shouldn't have the right to subsidize? I mean, that's the neoliberal dream. Capital could go anywhere it wants without papers. But people, no.
Yeah. I'm glad you raised the long history, because humanity's been around a long, long time, and it's really only in the last couple hundred years that states have advanced human freedom at all, and only when there's fire from below. So I think people have to remember that the state is not your friend when it comes to freedom unless there's fire from below. And then we see small advances in the nature of human freedom.
Exactly. No, I totally agree with that. And when that fire from below crosses borders in solidarity, it's a real fire.
It's a real fire. Yeah, I always feel like as a part-time wobbly, I often think, we need a one big union, one general strike internationally. It's not right here, not in one industry.
Well, the wobblies have the best slogans. I mean, you think about it. I mean, the best slogans: one big union, injury to one is an injury to all.
Exactly.
Which is that's way beyond compassion or empathy.
Exactly.
That's simply say that's solidarity.
I've been a long time admirer of your work and your activity, but I'm looking here at a book on the table that you wrote, a classic about the Loneliest Monk, and then I'm looking at you, and your work on Marx, and then on social movements. I'd like you to talk a bit about surrealism and Marxism, feminism. I mean, you claim all these as parts of who you are and what your work is about. How do you come to the surreal in this?
Oh boy. It seems like an easy question, but it actually is not that easy.
No, I didn't intend it to be easy. So,
you know, Marxism has a lot to do with my path to surrealism, and in fact, the way Freedom Dreams is structured, it's each chapter is autobiographical. In the sense, it doesn't come across that way, but I kind of went through all these movements. I mean, I came up in high school and college as a black nationalist with, Marxist proclivities thanks to my sister. And what the story of Freedom Dreams lays out is not that it's a kind of evolution from one to the other. I carried each one of those categories. I still carry a piece of me that believes in the land question,
mm-hmm.
And I was listening to you, actually, one of your shows before, talking about the impact that, say, the Black Nation thesis, the Communist Party, and the Republic of New Africa had. I mean, I grew up with that. I mean, I grew up thinking, okay, there's something else, something that's possible in this idea of self-determination. So what I'm saying is that the question of socialism never ever left any of those categories. By the time we get to surrealism is also my reckoning with Marxism. Because the most important teacher I've had besides my mother was the late Cedric Robinson, who wrote Black Marxism. And when you read that book very carefully, it is a loving critique of Marxism, which says, wait a second, all the things that we think we knew about, socialism, for example, what we knew about consciousness, Marx tried, but of course, Marx and Engels failed in some places. And he gives his critique that made me think about the places where Marxism in many ways failed. It failed to come to terms with a politics of love. It failed to come to terms with the psyche and the unconscious, and the question of desire. Because, and I'm not saying that if Marx were around sitting with us, he'd probably agree. He'd probably be disagreeable about some things and agree with this. But I'm not saying that it's about right or wrong, but it is about recognizing that as human beings in this quest for human freedom, that freedom is not reducible to our ability to reproduce ourselves. It's just simply not. Freedom is something that's way deeper than that. Sometimes it has intangibles. It is about being able to be a free thinker, being able to recognize other forms of knowledge that only can be manifest through feeling and through poetry and not necessarily through the rational. We are all products around the globe of the rational side of the Western Enlightenment, imposed on us. But there's other sides of the Enlightenment that got lost, the romantic side, that got crushed in some ways. And there's other modes of thought, and this is where surrealism comes in, that are outside of the West itself. That my family grew up with, come from Jamaica and also from the U.S. South, certain kinds of practices of being able to commune with ancestors, things like that, which to me are real. That's like real. I mean, I have a very funny story about the Loneliest Monk, which is a true story. And this is where I was working on this book, and I was trying to get people to talk to me, and I was frustrated, and then I got hit by a car. In fact, I got hit by a car on November 9th, 2001. It was right after 9/11. I was in Newark. It's a whole long story, but I'm like in the hospital, broken leg, surgery, concussion, and there's funny parts of the story which I won't go into, but I'll just say this much. Someone had said to me, a great scholar, photographer, C. Daniel Dawson, who knows a lot about Santeria, and he says, did you ever ask Monk permission to write the book? And I said, well, what do you mean? It's like, did you actually ask the Loneliest Monk permission? Because you have to be able to ask them. It's because the reason that you got hit was Ogun speaking to you. That's metal. That's saying you need to wake up. And so he came over with some other friends. We created an altar. I put a picture of Monk's daughter who died very young of cancer. I put a picture of the Loneliest Monk. I had a clear glass of water I changed every day. I had other original music. And for 2 weeks, I would ask permission to write this book. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, all these people started calling me and saying, oh yes, of course I'll talk to you.
Nice.
Nellie Monk, his widow, was like, yes, of course I'll talk to you. And things change. And, when that happens, I'm sorry, I've read every volume of collective works of Marx and Engels, 40 volumes, letters, manuscripts, and none of that's in there.
Exactly. Exactly.
So that's where surrealism is important, because that's my own personal story. But the larger question is, it raises the issue about what's the role of art and creativity in producing the visions of freedom that can move us beyond the utilitarian to the transcendent.
Yeah, I notice you've written with Franklin Rosemont, a Chicagoan. You bring to mind Gwendolyn Brooks in her great poem about the Picasso. She says, does man love art? And her answer, man visits art but cringes because art urges voyages. And in some ways, I love your thing about not leaving marks behind but bringing them with you. I still carry around my Students for Democratic Society membership card because I never left. I'm still in the Weather Underground. I don't want to leave those things behind. I want to learn from them. They can be good teachers, but there's always more. And,
right.
And the idea that you get it figured out, that's where dogma comes in the worst way. So we should always be figuring it out. And who's teaching you now? One of the things I really, as I say, admire your work so much, but one of the things I admire, and you and I are lucky, we've been professors, we've been around young people, but we mentioned Harsha Walia, and then you introduced me to Derek Purnell, and you said to me, don't talk to me, go talk to Derek Purnell. So I got her book, and she's amazing, but one of the things that you've made a point of in your life, and you're not yet an elder, you're catching up. Or are you an elder?
I'm an elder.
Okay.
I'm a member of AARP.
Okay,
I get those discounts.
Oh shit!
I'm telling you.
So we're advanced elders. We're almost over. But no, I think there's something very important about the fact that you continue to not only be in dialogue with and in touch with, but kind of helping folks find a path into the public, and that's very admirable to me.
Yeah, well, I'll be honest, they helped me find a path.
Exactly.
That's why I hang out with all these young people, and Derica is amazing. Her partner now, Fort's amazing. There's there's a wonderful generation. But you know what, let me go back though to something else you said about being stuck in dogma, because it's not hard to be stuck.
No, it's easy.
It's easy, exactly.
Yeah.
It's a fallback, because you have all the answers. But one person that all of us are burning beans here, share is a connection to Gracie Boggs.
Exactly.
And I have to say, besides Cedric Robinson and my mother, I would put Grace up there as being one of the most important teachers I've ever had. Freedom Dreams, which I write about her in the new introduction, and the impact that she had both in inspiring the book, but also pushing me even harder after the book came out. And that is that, Grace and Jimmy Boggs, they left dogma behind way before I was born.
Absolutely.
They're thinking hard, and I don't think that. Here we're at the Socialism conference. I'm not sure how much we as a so-called left appreciate what it means to leave that behind and to think in original terms. That is hard. It means that you actually have to think both collectively but without a net.
Exactly. I think we had breakfast with Grace Bernadine and I on her 100th birthday, and she passed away shortly afterwards. But one of the things that always left us breathless with Grace was that she was willing to make a concrete analysis of concrete conditions today. Not something she had figured out 50 years ago and she was riding on, but she was willing to say, but look, this is new, this is a different thing. And I think for you, and I think for me as well, I think surrealism and poetry and art allow us to do that. They challenge us to not get stuck. And I think it's easy to get stuck because it's more comfortable.
Yes.
Very uncomfortable, as Gwendolyn Brooks says, man visits art but cringes.
Right,
you know?
right, exactly. And the cringing part is very important too, because art does challenge us. It reveals sometimes the deepest fears and contradictions, even when it's most beautiful. And Monk had this, the only waltz he ever wrote was called Ugly Beauty. And in many ways, that song title captures the reality that we all face. We wish we can have that, that pristine beauty, when we write about how we imagine the future. But, we also see the same conditions that produce the possibility of freedom also produce the possibility of constricting that freedom.
That's right.
And there's no guarantee. The only thing that we can promise is the struggle. We can't guarantee the outcome. And art, in some ways, reminds us of both the dark outcome, but also the bright outcome.
Yeah.
And they're not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Yeah, one of my great teachers was Maxine Greene, and she always said, look, the imagination is a motherfucker because it took a great imagination to think of Auschwitz.
Yes.
And so she always emphasized the social imagination. What can we imagine together that would allow us to live freer, more liberated lives? Let me ask you one last thing, and that is, what is your freedom dream today?
Besides retirement. I don't have a good answer for that question because in many ways, part of what I try to do with the book is talk about people in motion. And I have to say, if I gave you an answer today, next week it might change.
Of course, and it should.
Right.
It should.
Because we're always in motion, and if anything, I think when we get past the binary of winning and losing, and move toward what does it mean to be in constant struggle to create the conditions for human freedom. If I have a freedom dream, it is that more of us can be in that struggle together, and then we see what we come up with. When I say more of us, I mean the whole world.
I get it.
We're facing a catastrophe that is unlike any other in human history, in terms of what the climate and what years of capitalist extraction and pollution and violence has done. And so if we're not together, if we're not thinking about human freedom, not for ourselves, but for the other. Like my daughter talks about, thinking about, she talks about the love letter, that the beauty of the love letter is that, my daughter's Robin Kelley, the beauty of the love letter is that when you send it, there's no expectation of a response. And we have to be able to send ourselves in our love, in our solidarity with the world with no expectation of reciprocity, of something getting back, but knowing that this is how we save ourselves as a community, because it's like, you put the, you may put the mask on yourself, but you got to help others.
Right.
And we got to do that.
Yeah, the love letter is not transactional, and neither is the freedom struggle.
Exactly.
Robin Kelley, I cannot thank you enough for your time, for your wisdom, for your brilliance, for every one of your books, and I appreciate you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill. It's great seeing you.
Damn, dude. That was just brilliant, man.
I'll
There was so much
say.
more I wanted to talk about, but goddamn, we went for 40 minutes. Let's give
Oh
you
yeah,
a
that's
break.
good. Yeah, I wasn't even prepared. I don't know what you're gonna ask me.
I mean, I want you to be. I just wanted to talk to you. This is